I'm John Atack, as I always have been. And are you an Aaron or an Aaron?
To me, those are the same. My mom always says Aaron, but I say Aaron.
Okay, well, this is Aaron Smith-Levin, who is a very celebrated person, I may say, one of the few people who's really stood up against Scientology and taken all of those risks, which I understand very well, to get information out there to help people who've been involved and to slow down the depredations of the Scientology cult. So perhaps you could start by telling us a little about your background and how you became involved with Scientology and how you became uninvolved.
Sure. So I generally say I was born and raised in Scientology. I was 4 years old when my mom got into Scientology in Philadelphia. There's only one Scientology organization in all of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, and that's in Philadelphia.
Okay.
Isn't that funny? People don't realize people really don't realize how small Scientology actually is.
Yeah, down to about 20,000 IAS members, I'm led to believe. It's tiny,
Yeah.
tiny.
It is for such a small organization that makes so much trouble and makes so much noise.
Yeah.
So I was 4 when my mom got into Scientology, and she wasn't just like introduced as a public and dabbled for a while. She pretty much joined staff right away. Some of my earliest memories are being in the org and being in the nursery. Orgs had nurseries back then. The nurseries ended up being much more trouble than they're worth.
Yeah.
So I was 4 years old when my mom got into Scientology, and I was 12 years old when I was taken out of school, public school, to start working full-time for Scientology, which I did in Philadelphia, in Clearwater, Florida, in Los Angeles. And, working for Scientology in the first few years was really full-time study. I mean, there was also a lot of manual labor involved in there and stuff like that. But I was 15 years old when the full-time study part ended, and it was work. It was on post. So from 15 years old to 26 years old, I was a staff member and a Sea Org member. And then when I was 26, I was in the Sea Org in Los Angeles. My wife and I got pregnant, and we said we're not having an abortion. So we left the Sea Org, and we were still considered public in good standing until 2014, which is when I got officially declared. And then my wife eventually did. So I say 2014 is when I officially left Scientology. 2009 is kind of when my route out of Scientology began, because of the Tampa Bay Times articles about the senior executives who'd left Scientology and were speaking out about the abuse at the international base at the hands of David Miscavige and things like that. So from 2009 to 2014 was kind of a gradual path out of Scientology.
No.
And as you know, Scientology isn't really in the habit of getting rid of people. They will try to keep you and keep you and keep you and keep you until they realize that they can't. And then they say, well, get out of here. We never wanted you anyway, you piece of crap. And so people ask me, well, what made you decide to leave? And you have to go, well, nothing really. I didn't actually want to leave. I wanted to stay even when I no longer believed. I mean, I wanted to stay even, but then you go, but what do you mean you wanted to stay? Because officially leaving Scientology means everyone you've ever known has to sever ties with you. And me no longer believing in Scientology did not mean I wanted that to happen. I was working for a Scientologist. So was my wife. All of our friends were Scientologists. Our kids were going to a Scientology school. Her whole family was Scientologists, brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, all that kind of stuff. Like, there was no part of my losing my belief in Scientology that made me go, oh yeah, I don't want to associate with anyone I've ever known my whole life. So
that is a truly terrible thing, that the idea that your network of friends and relatives is now forbidden to you. That, of course, I still miss people who've not been allowed to talk to me since 1983. But there's still people that I'm fond of and would like to see again. So friendship doesn't end with a change in belief. Though, of course, if you're a Scientologist, it does, because it's not real friendship.
Absolutely. Well, and that's why I was, in some respects, fighting so hard to stay in, even though I didn't give a damn about Scientology anymore. And I didn't give a damn if my friends still believed in Scientology. Makes no difference to me. It's really Scientology who creates the framework of rules that brings these sort of conflicts into being, where people have to make ridiculous choices. And, even before I was in my personal conflict of, are they going to kick me out? Are they not? Am I going to, bend the knee? Am I not? There was an earlier similar incident.
Beginning
when
tell me when
after they had declared my mom, because she got declared for basically spreading around, basically talking poorly of David Miscavige. And there was the point of, were they going to insist that I disconnect from her or not? And I was making the argument for, you really should let me just do the good roads, good weather stuff here. And I was even like, and if that means I'm not eligible for any training or courses, by golly, that's okay with me. Let's just, I don't care if you put a big fat, PTS type whatever label on me. But, if you could just really not demand that I disconnect from my mother or else, that sure would make existence easier for her, easier for me. And let me tell you something, easier for you, I promise.
Yeah, and they should have listened, let's face it.
They should have listened. It is one of the reasons I take a certain amount of glee in the work I do to shine a light on Scientology, is because in the back of my head, I'm thinking to myself, you guys could have avoided all of this. You know that, right? I gave you like 10 opportunities to make this easier on all of us, including yourselves. Now, in retrospect, thank God they kicked me out. I wouldn't be where I am in life now if that hadn't occurred. And I can't say that if I was back in that time, in that headspace, that I would actually want it to occur again, because it was all quite devastating. But things have turned out for the best. It's fantastic not to live being spied on by your friends, your employees, your coworkers, your employers. It's amazing that you get accustomed to that kind of stuff.
Yeah. That
it just becomes normal, that everyone in your life is spying on you for this entity. It's wild stuff.
And what did you what made you active publicly against Scientology?
What do you mean?
Well, why did you choose to speak out? Why did you think? Because you knew the risks, I'm sure.
Well, I didn't take any of those risks until after I'd been expelled. Is that what you mean? Or is that what you mean?
Yeah, it's just that many people, even if they're expelled, declared suppressive, will simply walk away, turn their back.
Oh, yeah, that's not in my nature.
Mine neither.
Oh, yeah, that's probably just the best answer I can give. That is nowhere in my nature. What I'm trying to remember is, what's the first thing I did that could even be considered speaking out? So what's interesting is that even that wasn't something I set out to do, if I'm recalling it accurately. And here's what I'm remembering. So, just before I got officially declared, which occurred in 2014, just before that, in late 2013, the guy that I was working for was a very prominent Scientologist named Kurt Feshbach. Yeah. And I was working for him in the hedge fund investment research field. Hmm. And Scientology, he's a very, very important, he's a VIP in Scientology. They didn't want to put him in a legal dilemma by declaring me while I still worked for him. Mm. So they gave him the heads up. And even though I'd been working for him for 5 years, and the goal was for me to eventually take over for him, all of a sudden there were all these very important issues that needed to be addressed. Aaron was being too mean to the people who worked under him. Aaron, this, that. And then I got laid off, and I actually recorded this meeting. I still have a recording of this meeting where they laid out this whole, explanation for why we were going in this direction. And at the end of that meeting, I said, you guys know that I know everything you just said is total horseshit, right? you guys know that I know that Scientology's been in touch with you and has given you this opportunity to get rid of me so that I can't sue you for religious discrimination. Like, you understand that, right? And they're like, oh my God, what? How dare you? How could you think that of us? I was like, okay, fine. So he let me go. I was immediately forced but helped by others to go into business for myself in the exact same industry doing hedge fund research. And I had some projects early on that were a bit high profile and got a little bit of exposure, and something was written about it in Forbes magazine. And there was a mention, they asked me about Scientology. And I said something about declining to talk about it. Now, behind the scenes, I told the journalist, Nathan Vardy, I said, oh God, I can't publicly comment on Scientology. I said, I've already been declared, but my wife hasn't. And we're trying to navigate this process so that she doesn't have to lose her family. And if you publish something, it's gonna screw everything up. So please don't get into the Scientology stuff. And he was like, oh my God. He's like, okay, I'll just put like decline to discuss it or something. Somebody sent this article to Tony Ortega, and Tony put up a blog piece basically trying to blow me out of the water. Like, oh my God, look at the Scientology connection here in Wall Street. Da, 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 da. And so I emailed Tony behind the scenes, and I'm like, hey, dude, you fucking idiot. I'm the one that's been emailing you for like months and months and months, giving you all the secret information. And he's like, oh, you should speak out publicly. You should speak out publicly. Now, as I sit here now, I do not remember if I then did some sort of a follow-up post with Tony or not. But that's how it started. Like, I had no intention of being surprised. Here I am. Because my wife was still going through absolute hell. You know, I mean, even after, like, she was still holding on to the idea that she was going to be able to keep this connection with her family.
Yeah.
And even after she officially got declared, she was still holding on to this belief that there was something that she was going to be able to do to salvage this relationship with her family. So I wasn't just in the background going, hey, good luck with that. While you're worrying about that, I'm going to be over here making sure that never happens. Yeah. You know, so I don't have a very specific memory, and I'm sure I'm just forgetting something, of doing something so-called going public until launching my YouTube channel 7 years ago. And it's called Growing Up in Scientology. And the purpose of that was just to have a platform where second generation members could tell their unique sort of story and perspective. You have these whole generations of people who never even chose to be Scientologists, and yet have come to form, you know, probably the vast majority of Scientologists that exist right now. And that's an interesting story, because usually when someone's talking about their joining Scientology, they have a lot to say about how they came to actually join Scientology. And yet people who were born into it don't really have that component to their story. No. You know, and at that time, there just wasn't really a place where stories were being told that weren't being somehow curated and moderated by people who'd never been in Scientology. Yeah. And we were like, well, let's just try something different. And even that, it was interesting because the goal wasn't really, oh, let's expose this, let's expose that. The goal was, let's tell a story from a different perspective. Now, perhaps there was some, but for years behind the scenes, I'd been giving information to Mike Rinder and Marty Rathbun and Tony Ortega. And I was happy to keep doing that forever. Like, I did not pick this fight with Scientology. Now you know that they would go, well, you did pick the fight by giving them information. And it's like, oh, whatever, potatoes. But and then, of course, there was the Scientology in the Aftermath show. And that just came about because, you know, I'd become such good friends with Mike. And at that point, Mike was working for me in my hedge fund research business. So we were together, you know, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day for a year or whatever it was. And then the idea, Leah had been talking with some production company about the idea of this television show. And that's how you'll notice season 1 is basically, if you look at who's in the season 1 of the show, it's basically just Mike's friends, because it was the lowest hanging fruit. So that's how all that came to be. It sort of was all relatively organic. I feel like I didn't necessarily pick this fight or choose this path, but But as far as running away from these guys or ignoring them, it's like, nah. Once you see how the sausage is made, there's really not a lot to be afraid of. And sometimes it rubs people the wrong way when I say that, because it's not true that there's nothing to be afraid of. But when you see how the sausage is made, you're like, this is a clown show, you guys. I'm not going to give anyone the excuse to be afraid of them. I'm going to try to give people excuses not to be afraid of them. Oh, but they'll do this and that to you. Yeah. But at the end of the day, what did it accomplish? Like, they've got a website up about me. Yeah. That's like, people are endlessly entertained by that website. Who cares? It's never cost me a relationship. It's never cost me a client. It's never cost me a job. It's never cost me a minute of sleep. Like, who cares about the website? And I know everyone doesn't see it that way. And I don't say it to mean nobody should ever be afraid of them or whatever. I guess it's like, they want you to be afraid. So don't do them the favor, is kind of how I approach it. And yeah, I know everyone doesn't see it that way, but look, you've been right in the thick of it for almost 40 years or 40 years. I mean, yep, and maybe you would have a different story. Maybe sometimes you can tell me, well, here's how they did screw me for real. And I'm interested in that, because like, I know a lot of people have been destroyed or near destroyed. I mean, the story of Paulette Cooper is unfathomable. Yeah. And to be honest, I'm not sure I know very much about other people who have stories similar to what happened to Paulette Cooper. I'm not even sure I have much information about other people's stories like that.
I think it's largely a matter of how many people were speaking out and how much firepower Scientology had. And I think the internet changed everything. So I started speaking out in 1983, and I had a pretty rough ride of it for 16 years, because I was the only person in the UK saying anything. So it was very easy for them, and especially that I continued to live in East Grinstead until 1994. So anybody who was doing a so-called liability formula could come around and knock on my door, and we
no way.
Yeah, we had all sorts of stuff. Yeah, people would turn up at 11 o'clock at night and tell me, I had some guy telling me that I'd broken up his relationship with his girlfriend. And wow. I'd invite them in and talk to them, because I don't really follow their policies about not communicating with people. I'm not really frightened of communicating with people. And I think that's one of the horrors of Scientology, that it makes people think, oh, no, this person's suppressive. They'll have some malicious animal magnetism or something that will cross over to me, some N theta. I didn't have that. But this guy, so I said to him, well, what's your girlfriend called? And he told me. I said, I've never heard of her, let alone persuaded her to do anything. But they'd shout at me. They'd, all sorts of stuff. I had people with placards outside my house, which was amusing, because the pavement was only about 3 feet wide and the police would keep coming and moving them off. All sorts of things, bank accounts hacked. I was sued and bankrupted totally by legal costs. They found things they could sue me for that I couldn't get legal aid to defend myself on. Wow. And they beat me. We never went to trial on any issue. They beat me with all of the paper mountain that comes before the cases. So yeah, back then it was, they could focus more. There were very few of us, Jerry Armstrong, Lawrence Wallersheim, Bob Penny, then Vaughan and Stacey Young came along, Jeff Jacobson. There are people who go way back and have been doing this for a long time. With the internet, suddenly there were thousands of people who could anonymously, or theoretically anonymously, post. And a few people like yourself, like Tony Ortega, Chris Shelton, Karen de la Carriere came out and said, well, we're going to talk about it. And Chris has said to me that he's not been harassed at all, and he's almost disappointed about it. For me, it was every day, there'd be something happening, and there were private detectives involved and all sorts of things. And I think that's very healthy. I think that, a lot of the problem with Scientology is exactly as you said, the fear. And that Jerry Armstrong pointed out to me when I first met him in '84, that fear was the tone level of the Sea Organization, that people were terrified, as you say, you're being reported on. You've got to keep everything together. You mustn't say anything that can be taken against you. And far from creating superhumans with fantastic cognitive and emotional abilities, it's actually confining people and enslaving them psychologically. How about the process of recovery from Scientology? Some people very resilient and they just walk away. I had no problems, but I also wasn't humiliated or abused. I was treated as a celebrity because I write and I paint and play music. I didn't make any money doing it, but I was treated as a celebrity. So there were a couple of times in 9 years that I was shouted at, and I shouted back, and that's it. And then when I left and started hearing the stories that people had to tell about the rehabilitation project force and rice and beans diets and all of this sort of thing, and seeing that so many people come away with some form of post-traumatic stress, that there are things, they'll have nightmares, they won't sleep properly, they'll be hypervigilant, they'll be reading subtext into what people are saying to them. How have you found it? What, 7-8 years since you left?
Well, I'm glad to hear you say you didn't have some big giant existential crisis or collapse or whatever, because I really haven't either.
Oh, good.
My time on staff and as a Sea Org member is a bit of a strange contradiction between strong belief and strong dedication on the one hand, and on the other hand, not really believing and thinking these guys need me more than I need them, but I'll stick around as long as I'm willing to.
Yeah.
And I can tell different stories that highlight either sides of that coin, and they existed at the same time in a weird way. Mm-hmm. There were so many, and this really became obvious to me in a lot of the interviews and conversations that I've had with Chris Shelton, because in many respects, he truly believed in Scientology much, much more than I did. Mm. And yet you could go, and yet I don't want to characterize myself as someone who didn't believe, because the truth is I believed to a level where I never had to be handled to do anything. If I handled myself.
Yeah, me too. So
I believed it to such a level that, like, I was never someone who would go to someone else and go, I would never seek someone else to explain to me why I should do the thing I was being asked to do. I either wouldn't fucking do it, or I would handle myself on why it was really the right thing to do, and then I would do it. Yeah. No one was pulling my strings. Mm-hmm. And even though I never did much of the bridge, I never did pretty much any of the bridge. And yet I was dedicating my life to delivering the bridge to others. And that dedication alone indicates a certain level of belief. But John, there was a moment, it was one day when I was on post as the TechSec ASHO, that I was waiting for course to get out. I was, standing at the end of the hallway, waiting for course to get out. I was going to do some announcement to the student body. And I just reflected for a second there, just to myself. And I was like, I do this. I spend every waking hour doing, getting these people who are in these course rooms to do what they're doing right now. But if I was in their shoes, if I wasn't a Sea Org member, if I wasn't a staff member, and I was just Joe Public, would I ever spend 1 penny of my money or 1 minute of my time to come into these course rooms and read something L. Ron Hubbard wrote with a course supervisor, standing over my shoulder, harassing me anytime I stared off into space or tapped my finger on the table? Not for a goddamn second would I spend my time and money doing the things that these people are in here doing under my supervision. Now, you might think, well, geez, you must have left the Sea Org shortly after that, right? No, I was in for like 3 more years. Mm-hmm. This weird contradiction of, like, the way I tell that story, it sounds like you barely believed. You're like, but I was there. Like, if I didn't believe, why did I stay for 3 more years? And it's this funny thing of, like, I didn't like auditing. I didn't enjoy auditing. I didn't want auditing. I didn't want to deliver auditing to others, but I believed in the prison planet story. And I believed in the state of full operating Phaeton. I believed that part of the story. And so if I was struggling or not doing well on post, or should I leave, should I not leave, I would literally sit down by myself and go, okay, just remember, like, why are we doing any of this? What is the purpose of any of this? What's the purpose of Scientology? What's this? And I would go, okay, yes, full OT, prison planet, you know, da 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 da. Who cares about this hardship or this upset or this, you know, sacrifice or whatever? Just, you know, you stick on this. This is the right path to eventually get to where we want to go, even though you don't actually want to walk the path yourself. Mm-hmm. And I'd be like, yeah, that sounds good to me. All right, let's go. Like, yeah. in some ways, it sounds very small-minded. Like, geez, you're really like, that's all it took. But you can see that also on some level, I was even thinking about all of this, probably to a greater degree than most people in my shoes would think about it. Like Chris believed in I'll give you an example. I knew if I was ever assigned to the RPF, I would never do it and I would leave the Sea Org. And Chris told me, he's like, oh no, I was a true believer that not only would he agree to do the RPF, not only did he would truly believe he deserved it.
Yeah.
That indicates a certain level of belief that I simply never had. I didn't believe in everything LRH wrote about PTSness. I could see the internal incoherence in his statements. Everything stems from PTSness. Oh, by the way, there's something called false PTSness and pretended PTSness. Oh, and by the way, one of the reasons you can appear PTS is you haven't studied enough Scientology. I'm like, there's a circular logic here that doesn't make any sense at all. And yet I would go, who gives a shit? And so I almost go, does that indicate a small-mindedness, or does that indicate an ability to silo information and distinguish? I don't know. I don't know if these things I'm describing make me sound smart or really stupid. It just makes it different than the experience of a lot of other people who I think had a much harder time when they were leaving Scientology, because they did sort of have a bit of an existential, what do I believe? What do I not believe? What's true? What's not true? And I'm kind of like, I was just there doing my job, guys. I beyond that, I wasn't all wrapped up in the, what do I believe? What do I not believe? And I think some of all of that is a function of the fact that I never decided to join Scientology.
Yeah.
I never decided Scientology was the answer for all my problems. It was a path that I was on, that my mom put me on. I didn't have a choice other than the fact that, I mean, I was a child. You don't have a choice. You just go where you're pointed, you know? So I really am sympathize or empathize or feel sorry for people who like were leaving Scientology. For them really is more of an existential crisis. I've had phone calls from people who I knew from Philadelphia, who, you know, start watching my videos, whatever, but they're still Scientologists. And this one guy called me up. He goes, "Oh man, you're really making I've been binge watching your videos all week, and you're really messing up my life, man. I don't know what to believe anymore." Except they're not laughing while they're saying it.
No.
And I kind of go, man, you don't have to pick what's true or what's not true. Like, I don't think of Scientology in terms of, does it work? Does it not work? Is it true? Is it not true? I don't think of Scientology in those terms. There's no part of Scientology that I still use or apply in terms of things that actually require you to do something, meaning contact assists, nerve assists, locationals, what have you. And people go, "Oh, is there any parts of Scientology you still believe?" And that's funny because I go, I never thought of Scientology as something you were supposed to believe. So like, if you go, the ARC triangle, okay, is that a useful way of thinking about how to approach people or resolve conflicts? Yeah, that's a useful way of thinking about things, in my opinion. I'm never going to sit someone...
Also, however, not in fact true and easy to disprove. So sometimes, well,
depending on what that even
for you, but the reality is that if you increase communication, you don't necessarily increase affinity. The example that Hubbard himself gives is that bullets are communication. And if somebody likes you more after you've shot them, there's something wrong. So it's a heuristic, but it's a faulty heuristic. But
well, sure. And that's also based on or somewhat relies on the fact of, does this thing Do you have to think of this thing in some sort of a scientific, it always works if you apply it 100% of the time? I never thought of Scientology in that way. Like you just said, that like the examples you can think of ways in which ARC doesn't work out the way Hubbard said, and you can think of ways in which it's probably a useful way to approach people. And even though I'm using that as an example, if someone asked me for advice on how to deal with A, B, and C or whatever, never in a million years would I ever sit them down, sketch out the ARC triangle, or even mention ARC, or even use those terms or anything. So is it something that sticks in my, but I do feel that if I'm having to come up with a way or advise a person on how to approach a thing, in the back of my head somewhere is kicking around the ARC triangle, but I'm not going to use those words. I don't care enough about it to make it a thing. But if someone asks me, if someone's in Scientology and like, oh, what's true, what's not true? That's where I kind of go, I don't think in terms of true or not true. I just think in terms of, did that kind of make sense to me? And was it useful if I think in those terms? Just the ARC triangle just is an example of something that I think is useful when used. It's useful if you want to think in those terms. And I might even still think in those terms, but you'll never hear me say those words because I don't care enough about those words or about the ARC triangle as a thing. I mean, do you understand what I'm saying, right?
I hope so, yeah.
I mean,
yeah. But there's so much in there that, you see, for me, the sundering point, I left the Church of Scientology because I thought Hubbard was gone. He wasn't. This was 1983. He was very much, this was the last demented bit of his activity, but he was running it. But I thought he'd gone. And I thought that the Commodore's messengers, the Watchdog Committee, whatever, had taken over. And I did not like the new enforced disconnection policy. That was the particular thing in September 83. That was the last nail. But thinking about it, I then came to know so much about Ron Hubbard so quickly because I got Michael Lynn Shannon's material, which people have forgotten about now. But he did an incredible research job, and James Phelan before him in the 60s, Alexander Mitchell in the 60s, Paulette Cooper, they all dug in and found a bit more. And there was a simple idea in Scientology, and that is honesty is sanity. The road to truth must be trod with true steps. And what was absolutely clear to me was that Aaron Hubbard was a liar. He was a liar in that you didn't have to look to external sources like his college records and things like that, which are available. You could look to what he himself said and the contradictions within it. And they are, what he says is so replete with contradiction. I crippled and blinded at the end of World War II in My Philosophy in 65, handwritten. 1957, I think it is, Communication and Isness. On the 25th of July, I went down to Hollywood and beat up 3 petty officers. Okay, crippled and blind at the end of World War II. Well, that's just 19 days later that he had in which to get crippled and blinded. In an interview he gave to Look magazine, November, December 1950, he says he never saw combat and had no war wounds.
Really?
Yeah. And then you get the claims to being a nuclear physicist. There's a tape that he made. I think it's the 23rd of September 1950, Introduction to Dianetics, which they've actually released. It's been released since I started researching, but they've put it out there. And in it, he says, I flunked the course in atomic and molecular physics at George Washington University, and which is what his grades say. But I realized he was lying. And if he was lying, then he shouldn't be trusted. And the next step for me was to say, I'm going to reject all of this, everything that I've been taught here. And I've done the data series course and all of this kind of thing. I'm just going to reject it all. And I'm going to then look at it piecemeal, bit by bit, and see if it's true. And I have to say that 39 years later, I've never once wanted to pick up the cans. It never. Every bit of Scientology that I've examined, much of it I've been able to find where it came from. And Aleister Crowley is a major source for a great deal of it. Things like the birth engram even go back to him. OTTR0 goes back to him. But looking at the people it came from, as Hubbard said, you usually find that the original source of material is better than somebody who's relaying it. And anything that's anywhere near useful in Scientology has a different origin and usually with somebody who understood it better than Hubbard. And Hubbard himself becomes very confused about what these things mean and contradicts himself along the way. The idea of, I think, Freud created a whole system, a way of looking at a human being, and Hubbard followed that. And because he had hypergraphia and couldn't stop talking and writing, he just kept trotting out this material. He also said that truth should be simple, and that people, as they gain altitude in society, they become more and more confusing about their subject. When you look at Scientology, it's no single individual has ever created such a body of work, and it does not do what it claims to do. It certainly doesn't create a benevolent society. I had a friend who left about the same time I did, and he said he thought about what would the end phenomenon be of if the Sea Org took the world over. And he said, well, it would be upset, disagreement. This was not a functioning organization. This was a very badly run organization that mistreats all of its members. So if Scientology took the world over, it'd be more like North Korea, I think, than paradise.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. The fact that life in the Sea Org, conduct in the Sea Org, the way of dealing with people in the Sea Org is so unpleasant. No compassion, no empathy. The ends always justifies the means. The group is always more important than the individual. And that is what the world would look like if Scientology took over the world.
Yeah, and there's this, one of the other imbalances is this notion that you can use the 8 dynamics, the 8 urges towards survival, and have vote across them. So if you want to resolve a situation, you decide whether it's good for you, first dynamic, good for your family and your sex life, second dynamic, good for the groups you belong to, good for mankind, good for matter, energy, space and time, good for the spiritual unit, and so on, up to the 8th dynamic, which is God. And I actually tried to do this thing where I got former members, and we got a dozen of us in the room, and I wanted to have a conversation about the principles. Did they work? Were they useful? And I started with the 8 dynamics, and I said, we'll start from my left, going around the room, and everybody can tell us a time when they've used the 8 dynamics to resolve a problem. Now, between us, we had about 200 years in Scientology in that room. Nobody had ever used the 8 dynamics to resolve a problem. That was very interesting. And you then go through it and you go, well, so it's good for 7 dynamics, but God doesn't like it. Nah, that's not going to work, is it? And my 1 vote is worth as much as the 4th dynamic, which is all of mankind. It's not a way of resolving anything. It's an attempt. Perry Chapdelaine, who co-wrote the Dianetic Axioms, he said Hubbard turned up one night with a bottle of scotch and said, we need to make this look like science. And so you get this. Has anybody ever read the Dianetic Axioms? Lambda and theta, yeah, and this, that, and the other. It's just an attempt to make something look scientific. As there was actually no research behind any of this, there's, the only attempt to prove Dianetics was in the Los Angeles Foundation in 50-51. And they did. Hubbard talks about it in Science of Survival. They knocked somebody unconscious to see if they could recover an engram.
No way. Really?
And they failed to recover anything. So, and that's it. That was the only actual piece of research done, to my knowledge, in all these many years of bullshit that Hubbard poured forth. Yeah.
What do you make of, again, an interesting contradiction between the fact that he does seem to have just made up so much of it, and then lied about the research and all this all this kind of stuff? That on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that he very clearly seemed to at least eventually believe all of this bullshit he was making up.
It depended whether there was an hour in the month or whether it was Wednesday. Some days he absolutely did not believe. So, for example, at the end of 1950, when he starts working on science of survival, he's living in LA with a woman called Barbara Snyder, Barbara Cloden, who will later go on to become a psychologist. And in an interview, she says that he spent most of his time lying in bed, drinking a bottle of whiskey a day, and complaining that he had no new ideas and nothing to say. And Richard DeMille, who took him on from there, they went to Cuba together, where he drank a bottle of rum a day. You know, you've got to get your medicine levels right. He actually wrote Science of Survival for Hubbard. From Hubbard's notes, from these peculiar little dictation discs, little green discs. I have seen one of them along the way somewhere. And DeMille put it all together and wrote the best book in Scientology, without doubt. Science of Survival is way ahead in terms of, you know, the ideas that are being put forward. And it's where I started, because it doesn't have anything about past lives. It doesn't, it's a straightforward, you know, your attention units are stuck on things, let's do this. But DeMille also, you know, Hubbard was miserable and depressed. At the end of his life, we're told in Going Clear that Serge Fouth was asked to make an e-meter that would kill him because he believed he'd failed completely. And then somewhere in the middle of that, in around about 1970, aboard the Apollo, Mary Sue Hubbard got into a screaming match with Ron Hubbard, calling him a charlatan, saying none of this works. You're just ripping people off. And so he said, what do I need to do to prove this? And she said, I've never been exterior with full perception. And he then got utter roast to run. He was told to run every exteriorization process, and there are about 90 of them. And after a couple of weeks, Mary Sue Hubbard just went, I can't do any more of this, stop it. So he was always faced with this idea that what he was doing was bogus. Then you have stories from behind the scenes. So, you know, the most harassed person for Scientology was L. Ron Hubbard Jr., Nibs Hubbard, who spent 7 years as his father's immediate deputy. And he talked about giving these advanced clinical courses, which they do twice a year, because that's where the money came from, $500 a pop. And his dad would sit him in the hotel room and he'd say, do you think we can make them do this? And that's how you get TR8, which was Nibs, he wrote it, yelling at ashtrays and making sure they stay in their place, you know. So I think the dynamic is really strange with Hubbard. I think there are times when he really believed he was, as OT8 and the old power processors say, the source of the universe, the demiurge, the creator God. I think there were days when he was so high that he thought that was true. But there are other days, because he was somewhat bipolar, when he realized that he was a scam artist. And, you know, different ends of the spectrum of his own feelings from one day to another.
So like even Mary Sue saying to him, I've never been exterior with full perception, and Ron responding by asking Otto to run all the exteriorization processes on her, to me indicates that he thought those processes would actually make her go exterior with full perception, or that he himself believes he had been exterior with full perception.
Well, that's one of the Scientology, yeah. In February 1938, he has his wisdom teeth extracted. He's on nitrous oxide, which is notorious. In the 19th century, there are nitrous oxide cults. He has that. He thinks he says that he was dead for 8 minutes. And he saw what he uses the word smorgasbord, because the word buffet is too simple, but a smorgasbord of knowledge was laid out before him. And then somebody says, no, he's not ready yet, send him back. That was his, as far as I can tell from everything I've read over the 48 years that since I first met the man's ideas, from everything I've read, that's the only time that Hubbard believed he was exterior. And he took all sorts of drugs after that. There's no doubt about that. He admits it there's a lecture where he talks about phenobarbital and having become a guinea pig in an experiment to get off addiction to phenobarbital. So that's him. He, of course, recommended amphetamines in vast quantities. If you have to grab hold of anything, grab hold of Benzedrine. We also think he used Demerol, which is a form of heroin, basically. So he's getting high. He may well have had temporal lobe epilepsy. I've got a piece coming out with Yuval Laor about that. And we've had a neuroscientist who's looked at it, who studied Hubbard in great detail and is aware of this and said, well, yeah, this does sound very plausible. And that puts us in a very different place. If Aaron Hubbard was psychiatrically ill, then Scientology is the world, the universe of L. Ron Hubbard. And it's a mad universe. It's a universe where after 3 days, whatever gain you've made will go because you're a potential trouble source. Well, that's the normal time of remission after faith healing. You know, people get up out of their wheelchairs and walk for 3 days, and then they fall down again after 3 days. Hubbard was on, you know, every 6 months, he was saying, I've now found the answer. And then it'd be like, no, I've now found the answer. The simple things like in 51, he banned the original Dianetic technique because it's hypnotic. It's right there in print, him saying you shouldn't do this. I pulled together that and a lot of other things in a paper called Never Believe a Hypnotist, which is a Hubbard quote from Science of Survival. And he claimed to have been a hypnotist from the age of 16. So you get into this situation where this man who is ill, mentally ill, is projecting outward his desperate need for a cure. And he's never cured. He's all of the things that he lists in Dianetics, you know, short-sightedness, bursitis in his right shoulder, where the bursa's not lubricating the muscle bone joint properly. Terror stomach, which he talked about, all of the things that he started out with and claimed to have cured with Dianetics, he still suffered from at the end of his life. So an exteriorization that's the total goal of Scientology, really. That's all they've got. You want to be out of your head. You want to be out of your mind. Well, there are those of us that don't think that's a good idea, you know, being out of your head. It's be 3 feet back of your head. Why? Why is that a good thing to do? And have you ever met anybody who could prove that they've done it? Because I haven't.
No, and I've never met a Scientologist who has ever convinced. First of all, I've met tons of Scientologists who say they've gone exterior. Not one of them have ever convinced me that they were telling the truth.
Well, and it's the exterior that's called depersonalization by psychiatrists, feeling as if you're outside of your body, as opposed to being able to perceive things outside of your body, you know, go to another planet.
That's right.
And how much that's just dissociation is hard to say.
Well, that's right. Any Scientologist who has ever told me they've gone exterior, this, that, or the other thing, and I've asked them any questions about it whatsoever, it became very obvious they were talking about a feeling. They were talking about a sensation. They were not talking about literally looking down on themselves or having any particular awareness at all. It is hard to overstate the importance exteriorization and the belief in exteriorization plays in Scientology. In some respects, it's the glue holding everything together. I was always very preoccupied with the fact that I've never gone exterior, never had the sensation, and it was something I was somewhat infatuated with. Like I was a little embarrassed I'd never felt that way or had that, and everyone around me is talking about, you know, casually mentioning this thing as it's just as common as eating eggs in the morning. I mean, Hubbard talks about it like it's literally the goal of auditing is to get you in a position where you can exteriorize at will. Yeah. Now you might also ask the question where, well, if you got to that point, why would you even want to be back in the body? I don't, you know, gives other questions. But look, I'm specifically thinking of a Scientologist I knew who joined later in life. He was literally a nuclear scientist. He had advanced degrees. He was wealthy. This is not a dumb guy. He probably didn't get into Scientology until he was in his 40s. He was telling me a story of he went to Flag to do his L rundowns and he exteriorized and and then he literally couldn't stand up straight walking from the auditing room to the examiner. He kept falling against the wall and he was laughing. Scientologists call it line charging, just uncontrollably laughing, you know, just out of his head, just exhilarated. And, you know, you try to, as I say that now, I'm like, wow, that sounds like a little bout of temporary insanity, if you ask me. And yet, if I were to hear, as I'm hearing this story, I'm like, I only wish I could experience that. if you can give me a drug that'll make me feel that way, I would take that in a second. I would love to know what that feels like. Scientology auditing never did it for me. And I do sort of wonder how much of, like, do we believe that guy? He believes himself. Whatever he experienced, and I realize just because you think something's true doesn't make it true. Like, I understand this. His perception of what he experienced was so powerful. I'm pretty sure that guy's still in Scientology. He's probably pursuing the permanent state of whatever he thinks he experienced in that moment.
Yeah.
I have a friend, lives here in Clearwater. His name's Eve Martin, still in Scientology. He's one of the guys who spied on me for the church and made sure I got expelled. I've had conversations with him when this is part of his spying on me. He would have conversations with me just to see how deep I would go into enemy lines so he could report me to the church. And in these conversations, he made it clear when he was doing the purification rundown, when he was in the sauna, he went exterior. And just one time that was probably 30, 40 years ago. And he goes, just because of that one incident, there's nothing anybody could tell me about Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, or David Miscavige that would ever make me not continue pursuing Scientology. Even if you tell me there's no OT 9 and 10 or any of this, I couldn't care. Even if you told me I had to give up my children, I wouldn't care. Because once his words, once I had subjective reality that I was a Thetan and I could be independent of my body, nothing could ever be more important to me than pursuing that. I was like, again, that sounds simplistically stupid.
Yeah. And narcissistic in the extreme. You're willing to abandon your own children. I'm going to have to skip off.
Oh yeah, no worries.
But I want to do this again. So
yeah, let's pick this up another time.
We'll close down for today. And it's been an incredible pleasure meeting you at last.
You as well.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.